Section 1 of Diary of a U-Boat Commander. Introduction. "I would ask you a favor," said the German captain as we sat in the cabin of a U-boat which had just been added to the long line of bedraggled captives which stretched themselves for a mile or more in Harwich Harbour in November 1918. I made no reply. I had just granted him a favor by allowing him to leave the upper deck of the submarine, in order that he might await the motor launch in some sort of privacy. Why should he ask for more? Undeterred by my silence, he continued, "I have a great friend, Lieutenant zur See von Schenk, who brought U-122 over last week. He has lost a diary, quite private. He left it in error. Can he have it?" I deliberated, felt a certain pity, then remembered the Belgian prince and other things, and so, looking the German in the face, I said, "I can do nothing." "Please." I shook my head. Then, to my astonishment, the German placed his head in his hands and wept. His massive frame, for he was a very big man, shook in irregular spasms. It was a most extraordinary spectacle. It seemed to me absurd that a man who had suffered, without visible emotion, the monstrous humiliation of handing over his command intact, should break down over a trivial incident concerning a diary, and not even his own diary, and yet there was this man crying openly before me. It rather impressed me, and I felt a curious shyness at being present, as if I had stumbled accidentally into some private recess of his mind. I closed the cabin door, for I heard the voices of my crew approaching. He wept for some time, perhaps 10 minutes, and I wished very much to know of what he was thinking, but I couldn't imagine how it would be possible to find out. I think that my behaviour in connection with his friend's diary added the last necessary drop of water to the floods of emotion which he had striven, and striven successfully, to hold in check during the agony of handing over the boat, and now the dam had crumbled and broken away. It struck me that, down in the brilliantly lit, stuffy little cabin, the result of the war was epitomized. On the table were some instruments I had forbidden him to remove, but which my first lieutenant had discovered in the engineer officer's bag. On the settee lay a cheap imitation leather suitcase, containing his spare clothes and a few books. At the table sat Germany in defeat, weeping, but not the tears of repentance, rather the tears of bitter regret for humiliations undergone and ambitions unrealized. We did not speak again, for I heard the launch come alongside, and, as she bumped against the U-boat, the noise echoed through the hull into the cabin, and aroused him from his sorrows. He wiped his eyes, and with an attempt at his former hardiness, he followed me on deck, and boarded the motor launch. Next day I visited U-122, and these papers are presented to the public, with such additional remarks as seem desirable. For some curious reason the author seems to have omitted nearly all dates. This may have been due to the fear that the book, if captured, would be of great value to the British Intelligence Department if the entries were dated. The papers are in the form of 2 volumes in black leather binding, with a long letter inside the cover of the second volume. Internal evidence has permitted me to add the dates as regard the years. My thanks are due to my friend K. for assistance in translation. Signed, Etienne. The Diary of a U-Boat Commander. 1 volume of my war journal completed, and I must confess it is dull reading. I could not help smiling as I read my enthusiastic remarks at the outbreak of war, when we visualized battles by the week. What a contrast between our expectations and the actual facts. Months of monotony, and I haven't even seen an Englishman yet. Our battle cruisers have had a little amusement with the coast raids at Scarborough and elsewhere, but we battle fleet fellows have seen nothing and done nothing. So I have decided to volunteer for the U-boat service, and my name went in last week, though I am told it may be months before I am taken, as there are about 250 lieutenants already on the waiting list. But sooner or later I suppose something will come of it. I shall have no cause to complain of inactivity in that service if I get there. New entry. I am off tonight for a 6 days' trip, 2 days of which are to be spent in the train, to the Verdun sector. It has been a great piece of luck. The trip has been arranged by the Military and Naval Intercommunication Department, and 2 officers from this squadron were to go. There were 130 candidates, so we drew lots. As usual, I was lucky and drew one of the 2 chances. It should be intensely interesting. New entry. At. Place deleted. I arrived here last night after a slow and tiresome journey, which was somewhat alleviated by an excellent bottle of French wine which I purchased whilst in the Champagne district. Long before we reached the vicinity of Verdun, it was obvious to the most casual observer that we were heading for a centre of unusual activity. Hospital trains travelling northeast and east were numerous, and twice our train, which was one of the ordinary military trains, was shunted onto a siding to allow troop trains to rumble past. As we approached Verdun, the noise of artillery, which I had heard distantly once or twice during the day, as the casual railway train approached the front, became more intense, and grew from a low murmur into a steady noise of a kind of growling description, punctuated at irregular intervals by very deep booms, as some especially heavy piece was discharged, or an ammunition dump went up. The country here is very different from the mud flats of Flanders, as it is hilly and well wooded. The Meuse, in the course of centuries, has cut its way through the rampart of hills which surround Verdun, and we are attacking the place from 3 directions. On the north we are slowly forcing the French back on either river bank, a very costly proceeding, as each wing must advance an equal amount, or the one that advances is enfiladed from across the river. We are also slowly creeping forward from the east and northeast in the direction of Douaumont. I am attached to a 105 centimeter battery. A young Major von Markel in command, a most charming fellow. I spent all day today in the advanced observing position with a young subaltern called Grabel, also a nice young fellow. I was in position at 6 a.m. and, as apparently is common here, mist hides everything from view until the sun attains a certain strength. Our battery was supporting the attack on the north side of the river, though the battery itself was on the south side and firing over a hill called L'Homme Mort. Von Markel told me that the fighting here had not been previously equalled in the war, such is the intensity of the combat and the price each side is paying. I could see for myself that this was so, and the whole atmosphere of the place is pregnant with the supreme importance of this struggle, which may well be the dying convulsions of decadent France. His Imperial Majesty himself has arrived on the scene to witness the final triumph of our arms, and all agree that the end is imminent. Once we get Verdun, it is the general opinion that this portion of the French front will break completely, carrying with it the adjacent sectors, and the French armies in the Vosges and the Argonne will be committed to a general retreat on converging lines. But, favourable as this would be to us, it is generally considered here that the fall of Verdun will break the moral resistance of the French nation. The feeling is that infinitely more is involved than the capture of a French town, or even the destruction of a French army. It is a question of stamina. It is the climax of the World War, the focal point of the colossal struggle between the Latin and the Teuton, and on the battlefields of Verdun the gods will decide the destinies of nations. When I got to the forward observing position, which was situated among the ruins of a house, a most amazing noise made conversation difficult. The orchestra was in full blast, and something approaching 12,000 pieces of all sizes were in action on our side alone, this being the greatest artillery concentration yet effected during the war. We were situated on one side of a valley which ran up at right angles to the river, whose actual course was hidden by mist, which also obscured the bottom of our valley. The front line was down in this little valley, and as I arrived, we lifted our barrage on to the far hillside to cover an attack which we were delivering at dawn. Nothing could be seen of the conflict down below, but after half an hour we received orders to bring back our barrage again, and Grabel informed me that the attack had evidently failed. This afternoon I heard that it was indeed so, and that one division, the 58th, which had tried to work along the river bank and outflank the hill, had been caught by a concentration of 6 batteries of French 75s, which were situated across the river. The unfortunate 58th, forced back from the riverside, had heroically fought their way up the side of the hill, only to encounter our barrage, which, owing to the mist, we thought was well above and ahead of where they would be. Under this fresh blow the 58th had retired to their trenches at the bottom of the small valley. As the day warmed up, the mist disappeared, and, like a theatre curtain, the lifting of this veil revealed the whole scene in its terrible and yet mechanical splendor. I say mechanical, for it all seemed unreal to me. I knew I should not see cavalry charges, guns in the open, and all the old-world panoply of war, but I was not prepared for this barren and shell-torn circle of hills, continually being freshly, and, to an uninformed observer, aimlessly lashed by shell-fire. Not a man in sight, though below us the ground was thickly strewn with corpses. Overhead a few aeroplanes circled round amidst balls of white shell bursts. During the day, the slow circling aeroplanes, which were artillery observing machines, were galvanized into frightful activity by the sudden appearance of a fighting machine on one side or the other. This happened several times. It reminded me of a pike amongst young trout. After lunch I saw a Spad shot down in flames. It was like Lucifer falling down from high heavens. The whole scene was enframed by a sluggish line of observation balloons. Sometimes groups of these would hastily sink to earth, to rise again when the menace of the aeroplane had passed. These balloons seemed more like phlegmatic spectators at some athletic contest than actual participants in the events. I wish my pen could convey to paper the varied impressions created within my mind in the course of the past day, but it cannot. I have the consolation that, though I think that I have considerable ability as a writer, yet abler pens than mine have abandoned in despair the task of describing a modern battle. I can but reiterate that the dominant impression that remains is of the mechanical nature of this business of modern war, and yet such an impression is a false one, for as in the past, so today, and so in the future, it is the human element which is, has been, and will be the foundation of all things. Once only in the course of the day did I see men in any numbers, and that was when at 3 p.m. the French were detected massing for a counter-attack on the south side of the river. It was doomed to be stillborn. As they left their trenches, distant pygmy figures in horizon blue, apparently plodding slowly across the ground, they were lashed by an intensive barrage, and the little figures were obliterated in a series of spouting shell bursts. 5 minutes later the barrage ceased, the smoke drifted away, and not a man was to be seen. Grabel told me that it had probably cost them 750 casualties. What an amazing and efficient destruction of living organisms! New entry. Another most interesting day, though of a different nature. Today was spent witnessing the arrangements for dealing with the wounded. I spent the morning at an advanced dressing station on the south bank of the river. It was in a cellar, beneath the ruins of a house, about 400 yards from the front line and under heavy shell fire. As close at hand was the remains of what had been a wood, which was being used as a concentration point for reserves. The cover afforded by this so-called wood was extremely slight, and the troops were concentrating for the innumerable attacks and counter-attacks which were taking place under shell fire. This caused the surgeon in charge of the cellar to describe the wood as our main supply station. I entered the cellar at 8 a.m., taking advantage of a partial lull in the shelling, but a machine gun bullet viciously flipped into a wooden beam at the entrance as I ducked to go in. I was not sorry to get underground. A sloping path brought me into the cellar, on one side of which sappers were digging away the earth to increase the accommodation. The illumination consisted of candles set in bottles, and some electric hand lamps. The center of the cellar was occupied by 2 portable operating tables, rarely untenanted during the 3 hours I spent in this hell. The atmosphere, for there was no ventilation, stank of sweat, blood, and chloroform. By a powerful effort I countered my natural tendency to vomit, and looked around me. The sides of the cellar were lined with figures on stretchers. Some lay still and silent, others writhed and groaned. At intervals, one of the attendants would call the doctor's attention to one of the still forms. A hasty examination ensued, and the stretcher and its contents were removed. A few minutes later the stretcher, empty, returned. The surgeon explained to me that there was no room for corpses in the cellar. Business, he genially remarked, was too brisk at the present crucial stage of the great battle. The first feelings of revulsion having been mastered, I determined to make the most of my opportunities, as I have always felt that the naval officer is at a great disadvantage in war as compared with his military brother, in that he but rarely has a chance of accustoming himself to the unpleasant spectacle of torn flesh and bones. This morning there was no lack of material, and many of the intestinal wounds were peculiarly revolting, so that at lunch-time, when another convenient lull in the torrent of shell fire enabled me to leave the cellar, I felt thoroughly hardened. In fact, I had assisted in a humble degree at 1 or 2 operations. I had lunch at the 11th Army Medical Headquarters Mess, and it was a sumptuous meal to which I did full justice. After lunch, whilst waiting to be motored to a field hospital, I happened to see a battalion of Silesian troops about to go up to the front line. It was rather curious feeling that one was looking at men, each in himself a unit of civilization, and yet many of whom were about to die in the interest thereof. Their faces were an interesting study. Some looked careless and debonair, and seemed to swing past with a touch of recklessness in their stride. Others were grave and serious, and seemed almost to plod forward to the dictates of an inevitable fatalism. The field hospital, where we met some very charming nurses, on one of whom I think I created a distinct impression, was not particularly interesting. It was clean, well organized, and radiated the efficiency inseparable from the German army. New entry. Back at Wilhelmshaven, curse it! Yesterday morning, when about to start on a tour of the ammunition supply arrangements, I received an urgent wire recalling me at once. There was nothing for it but to obey. I was lucky enough to get a passage as far as Mons in an Albatross scout which was taking dispatches to that place. From there I managed to bluff a motor car out of the town commandant, a most obliging fellow. This took me to Aachen, where I got an express. The reason for my recall was that Whitneisser went sick, and Arnheim being away, this has left only 2 in the operations ciphering department. My arrival has made us 3. It is pretty strenuous work, and, being of a clerical nature, suits me little. The only consolation is that many of the messages are most interesting. I was looking through the back files the other day, and amongst other interesting information, I came across the wireless report from the boat that had sunk the Lusitania. It has always been a mystery to me why we sank her, as I do not believe those things pay. New entry. Arnheim has come back, so I have got out of the ciphering department, to my great delight. I have received official information that my application for U-boats has been received. Meanwhile, all there is to do is to sit at this hole and wait. Section 2 of The Diary of a U-Boat Commander. 2nd June, 1916. I have fought in the greatest sea battle of the ages. It has been a wonderful and terrible experience. All the details of the battle will be history, but I feel that I must place on record my personal experiences. We have not escaped without marks, and the good old Koenig brought 67 dead and 125 wounded into port as the price of the victory off Skagerrak. But of the English there are thousands who slept their last sleep in the wrecked hulls of the battle cruises which will rust for eternal ages upon the Jutland banks. Sad as our losses are, and the gallant Lutzow has sunk in sight of home, I am filled with pride. We have met that great armada, the British fleet. We have struck them with a hammer blow, and we have returned. I was asleep in my cabin when the news came that Hipper was coming south with the British battle cruisers on his beam. In 5 minutes we were at our action stations. We made contact with Hipper at 5:30 p.m. Footnote 1. This is 4:30 GMT. Etienne. End of footnote. And Beatty turned north with his cruisers and fast battleships, and we pursued. 2 of the great ships had been sunk by our battle cruisers, and we had hopes of destroying the remainder, when at 6:55 the mist on the northern horizon was pierced by the formidable line of the British battle fleet. Jellicoe had arrived. 3 battle cruisers became involved between the lines, and in an instant one was blown up, and another crawled west in a sinking condition. Sudden and terrible are events in a modern sea battle. Confronted with the concentrated force of Britain's battle fleet, we turned to east, and for 20 minutes our high seas fleet sustained the unequal contest. It was during this period that we were hit 17 times by heavy shell, though, in my position in the after torpedo control tower, I only realized one hit had taken place, which was when a shell plunged into the after turret, and, blowing the roof off, killed every member of the turret's crew. From my position, when the smoke and dust had blown away, I looked down into a mass of twisted machinery, amongst which I seemed to detect the charred remains of bodies. At about 7:40 we turned, under cover of our smoke screen, and steered southwest. Our position was not satisfactory, as the last information of the enemy reported them as turning to the southward. Consequently, they were between us and Heligoland. At 11 p.m. we received a signal for divisions of battle fleets to steer independently for the Horn Reef swept channel. 10 minutes later we underwent the first of 5 destroyer attacks. The British destroyers, searching wide in the night, had located us, and with desperate gallantry pressed home the attack again and again. So close did they come that about 1:30 a.m. we rammed one, passing through her like a knife through a cheese. It was a wonderful spectacle to see those sinister craft rushing madly to their destruction down the bright beam of our powerful searchlights. It was an avenue of death for them, but to the credit of their service it must stand that throughout the long nightmare they did not hesitate. The surrounding darkness seemed to vomit forth flotilla after flotilla of these cavalry of the sea. And they struck us once, a torpedo right forward, which will keep us in dock for a month, but did no vital injury. When morning dawned, misty and soft, as is its way in June in the Bight, we were to the eastward of the British, and so we came honourably home to Wilhelmshaven, feeling that the young navy had laid worthy foundations for its tradition to grow upon. We are to report at Kiel, and shall be 6 weeks upon the job. New entry. Frankfurt. Back on 17 days' leave, and everyone here very anxious to hear details of the Battle of Skagerrak. It is very pleasant to have something to talk to the women about. Usually the gallant field greys hold the drawing-room floor, with their startling tales from their Western Front, of how they nearly took Verdun, and would have if the British hadn't insisted on being slaughtered on the Somme. It is quite impossible in many ways to tell that there is a war on as far as social life in this place is concerned. There is a shortage of good coffee, and that is about all. Arrived back on board last night. They have made a fine job of us, and we go through the canal to the Schillig Roads early next week. We are to do 3 weeks' gunnery practices from there, to train the new drafts. 1916, about August. At last! Thank heavens, my application has been granted. Schmidt, the secretary, told me this morning that a letter had come from the Admiralty to say that I am to present myself for medical examination at the board at Wilhelmshaven tomorrow. What joy! To strike a blow at last, finish for ever the cursed monotony of inactivity of this high seas fleet life. But the U-boat war, ah, that goes well. We shall bring those stubborn, blood-sucking islanders to their knees by striking at them through their bellies. When I think of London and no food, and Glasgow and no food, then who can say what may happen? Revolt! Rebellion in England, and our brave field greys on the west will smash them to atoms in the spring of 1917, and I, Karl Schenk, will have helped directly in this. Great thought, but calm. I am not there yet. There is still this confounded medical board. I almost wish I had not drunk so much last night. Not that it makes any difference, but still one must run no risks, for I hear that the medical is terribly strict for the U-boat service. Only the cream is skimmed. Well, tomorrow we shall see. Passed, and with flying colours. It seemed absurdly easy and only took 10 minutes, but then my physique is magnificent, thanks to the physical training I have always done. I am now due to get 3 weeks' leave, and then to Zeebrugge. I have wired to the little mother at Frankfurt. At Zeebrugge, or rather Bruges. I spent 3 weeks at home. All the family are pleased, except mother. She has a woman's dread of danger. It is a pleasing characteristic in peace time, but a cloy on pleasure in days of war. To her, with the narrowness of a female's intellect, I really believe I am of more importance than the fatherland. How absurd! Whilst at Frankfurt I saw a good deal of Rosa. She seems better looking each time I meet her. Doubtless she is still developing to full womanhood. Moritz was home from Flanders. He had 10 days' leave from Ypres, and though I have a dislike for him, he certainly was interesting, though why the English cling to those wretched ruins is more than I can understand. I felt instinctively that in a sense Moritz and I were rivals where Rosa was concerned, though I have never considered her in that light, as yet. One day, perhaps. These women are much the same everywhere, and I could see that having entered the U-boat service made a difference with Rosa, though her logic should have told her that I was no different. But is that right? After all, it is something to have joined this service. The guards themselves have no better cachet, and it is certainly cheaper. Here we live in billets and in a commandeered hotel. The life ashore is pleasant enough. The damned Belgians are sometimes sulky, but they know who is master. Bissing, a splendid chap, sees to that. As a matter of fact, we have benefited them by our occupation. The shops do a roaring trade at preposterous prices, and shamefully enough the German shopkeepers are most guilty. These pot-bellied merchants don't seem to realize that they exist owing to our exertions. I was much struck with the beautiful orderliness of the small gardens which we have laid out since 1914, and in fact, wherever one looks there is evidence of the genius of the German race for thorough organization. Yet these Belgians don't seem to appreciate it. I can't understand it. I find here that social life is very much gayer than at that mad town at Wilhelmshaven. At the high seas fleet bases there are the strictness and austerity that some people seem to consider necessary to show that we are at war, though heaven knows there was precious little war in the high seas fleet. Perhaps that was why the blood and iron regime was in full order ashore. Here, in Bruges, at any rate as far as the submarine officers are concerned, the matter is far different. When the boats are in, one seems to do as one likes, with a perfunctory visit to the ship in the course of the day. Wittnitz, the Commodore, favors complete relaxation when in from a trip. In the evenings there are parties, for which there are always ladies, and I find it is necessary to have a smoking. Footnote 1. A dinner jacket. End of footnote. I went to the best tailor to buy one, and found that I must have one made at the damnable price of 140 marks. The fitter, an oily Jew, had the incredible impertinence to assure me it would be cut on London lines. I nearly felled him to the ground. Can one never get away from England and things English? I'll see his account waits a bit before I settle it. There are several fellows I know here. Karl Müller, who was third watchkeeper in the York, and Adolf Hilmsbaumer, who was captain of G-176, are the two I know best. They are both doing a few trips as second in commands of the later U.C. boats, which are mine-laying off the English coasts. This is a most dangerous operation, and nearly all the U.C. boats are commanded by reserve officers, of whom there are a good many in the mess. Excellent fellows, no doubt, but somewhat uncouth and lacking the finer points of breeding. As far as I can see in the short time I have been here, they keep themselves to themselves a good deal. I certainly don't wish to mix with them. Unfortunately, it appears that I am almost bound to be appointed as second in command of one of the U.C. boats, for at least one trip before I go to the periscope school and train for a command of my own. The idea of being bottled up in an elongated cigar and under the command of one of those nautical ploughboys is repellent. However, the Von Schenks have never been too proud to obey in order to learn how to command. New entry. I have been appointed second in command to U.C. 47. Her captain is one Max Alten by name. Beyond the fact that I saw him drunk one night in the mess, I know nothing of him. I reported to him, and he seems rather in awe of me. His fears are groundless. I shall make it as easy as possible for him, for it must be as awkward for him as it is unpleasant for me. To celebrate my proper entry into the U-boat service, I gave the dinner party last night in a private room at Le Coq d'Or. I asked Karl and Adolf, and told them to bring 3 girls. My opposite number was a lovely girl called Zoe something or other. I wore my smoking for the first time. It is certainly a becoming costume. We drank a good deal of champagne and had a very pleasant little debauch. The girls got very merry, and I kissed Zoe once. She was not very angry. I think she is thoroughly charming, and I have accepted an invitation to take tea at her flat. She is either the wife or the chère amie of a colonel in the Brandenburgers. I could not make out which. Luckily, the gallant Kochschaffer is at the moment on the La Bassée sector, where I was interested to observe that heavy fighting has broken out today. I must console the fair Zoe. Both Karl and Adolf got rather drunk, Adolf hopelessly so, but I, as usual, was hardly affected. I have a head of iron, provided the liquor is good, and I saw to that point. New entry. We were sailing, or rather going down the canal to Zeebrugge on Friday, but the starting resistance of the port main motor burnt out, and we were delayed till Sunday, as they will fit a new one. I must confess the organization for repair work here is admirable, as very little is done by the crews in the U-boats, all work being carried out by the permanent staff, who are quartered at Bruges docks. Taking advantage of the delay, I called on Zoe Stein, as I find she is named. It appears she is not married to Colonel Stein. She told me he was fat and ugly, and laughed a good deal about him. She showed me his photograph, and certainly he is no beauty. However, he must be a man of means, as he has given her a charming flat, beautifully decorated with water-colours, which the colonel salved from the French chateau in the early days. These army fellows had all the chances. I bade an affectionate farewell to Zoe, and I trust Stein will be still busily engaged at La Bassée when I return in a fortnight's time. I am greatly obliged to Karl for the introduction, and told him so. He himself is running after a little grass widow whose husband has been missing for some months. I think Karl finds it an expensive game. Luckily Zoe seems well supplied with money, the essential ingredient in a joyous life. On Friday night we had an air raid, a frequent event here, but my first experience in this line. Unpleasant, but a fine spectacle. Considerable damage done near the docks, and an unexploded bomb fell in a street near our headquarters. 2 machines, British, brought down in flames. I saw the green balls (1) known as the flying onions, for the first time. A most fascinating sight to see them floating up in waving chains into the vault of heaven. They reminded me of making daisy chains as a child. At Zeebrugge. We are alongside the mole in one of the new submarine shelters that has been built. The boat is under a concrete roof over 3 feet thick, which would defy the heaviest bomb. We have much improved the port since our arrival. The port, so called, is purely artificial, and actually consists of a long mole with a gentle curve in it, which reaches out to seaward and protects the mouth of the canal. The tides are very strong up and down the coast, and constant dredging is carried out to keep 20 feet of water over the sill at the lock gates. On arrival last night we went straight into No. 11 shelter, as an air raid was expected, but nothing happened, so I went up to the Flandre, which seemed to be the best hotel here, full of submarine people, and I heard many interesting stories. There seems no doubt this U-boat war is dangerous work. I find the U.C. boats are beginning to be called the Suicide Club, after the famous English story of that name, which, curiously enough, I saw on the kinematograph at Frankfurt last leave. We Germans are extraordinarily broad-minded. I doubt if the works of German authors are seen on the screens in England or France. The news from the West is good. The English are hurling themselves to destruction against our steel front. We are now to load up with mines. I must stop writing to superintend this work. At sea, near the South Dogger Light. We loaded up the 10 mines we carry in an hour and 5 minutes. They were lifted from a railway truck by a big crane and delicately lowered into the mine tubes, of which we have 5 in the bows. The tubes extend from the upper deck of the ship to her keel, and slope aft to facilitate release. Having completed with fuel at Bruges, we took in a store of provisions, and Alten went up to the Commodore's office to get our sailing orders. We sailed at 6 p.m., and at last I felt I was off. Today, the 22nd, we are just north of the South Dogger, steering northwesterly at 9½ knots. The sea is quite calm, and everything is very pleasant. Our mission is to lay a small minefield off Newcastle in the East Coast War Channel. I have, of course, never been to sea for any length of time in a U-boat, and it is all very novel. I find the roar of the diesel engine very relentless, and last night slept badly in a wretched bunk, which was a poor substitute for my lovely quarters in the barracks at Wilhelmshaven. One thing I appreciate, and that is the food. It is really excellent. Fresh milk, fresh butter, white bread, and many other luxuries. I have spent most of the day picking up things about the boat. Her general arrangement is as follows. Starting in the bows, mine tubes occupy the center of the boat, leaving 2 narrow passages, 1 each side. In the port passage is the wireless cabinet and signal flag lockers, with storerooms underneath. In the starboard passage are 1 or 2 small pumps and the kitchen. The next compartment contains 4 bunks, 2 each side. These are occupied by Alten, myself, the engineer, and the navigating warrant officer. Proceeding further aft, one enters the control room, in which 1 periscope is situated, and the necessary valves and pumps for diving the boat. The next compartment is the crew space. 10 of the company exist here. Overhead on each side is the gear for releasing the torpedoes from the external torpedo tubes, of which we carry 1 each side. I think we borrowed this idea from the Russians. Then comes the engine room, an inferno of rattling noises, but excellent engines, I believe. At the after end of the engine room are the two main switchboards, in whose manner of working I am at present in some ignorance. The two main sets of electric motors are underneath the boards, in the stern, where we have a third torpedo tube. New entry. I had hardly written the above words when a message came that the captain would like me to come to the bridge. I went up in a leisurely fashion through the conning tower, which is over the control room, and reported myself. He indicated a low-lying patch of smoke on the horizon far away on the starboard bow. I was obliged to confess that it conveyed nothing to me, when he aroused my intense interest by stating that it was, without doubt, being emitted from a British submarine, who are known to frequent these waters. He was proceeding away from us, and was, even then, 6 or 7 miles away, so an attack was out of the question. The engineer, who had joined us, drew my attention to the thin wisp of almost invisible blue-grey smoke from our own stern. The contrast was certainly striking. Over dinner I gave it as my opinion that the British boats were pretty useless. Alten would not agree, and stated that, though in certain technical aspects they were in a position of inferiority, yet in personnel and skill in attacking they were fully our equals. He seemed to hold them in considerable respect, and he remarked that, when making a passage, he was more anxious on their account than in any other way. He informed me that, on the last passage he made, he was attacked by a British boat which he never saw, the only indication he received being a torpedo which jumped out of the water almost over his tail. Luckily, it was very rough at the time, which made the torpedo run erratically, otherwise they would have undoubtedly have been hit. What appeared to astonish him was the fact that the British boat had been able to make an attack in such weather. We are now charging on one engine, 500 amperes on each half battery. New entry. We are due back at Zeebrugge at 10 p.m. tonight. We should have been in at dawn today, but we received a wireless from the senior officer, Zeebrugge, to say that mine-laying was suspected, and we were to wait till the QR channel, from the Blankenberg buoy, had been swept. We lay in the bottom for 8 hours, a few miles from the western end of the channel. Our trip was quite successful, but not without certain excitements. On the night of the 23rd we passed fairly close to a fishing fleet on the Dogger Bank, and saw the lights of several steamers in the distance. As our first business was to lay our mines in the appointed place, we did not worry them. We burnt usual navigation lights, or rather side lights which appear to be usual, except that, by a little fitting which Alten has made himself, the arcs of bearing on which the lights show can be changed at will. His idea is that, should we appear to be approaching a steamer which he wishes to avoid, in many cases by shining a little more or less red or green light, we can make her think that we are a steamer on such a course that it is her duty by the rules of the road to keep clear of us. He tells me it has worked on several occasions, and he has also found it useful to have two small auxiliary side lights fitted, which are the wrong colours for the sides they are on. It is, of course, only neutral shipping which carry lights nowadays, though Alten says that many British ships are still incredibly careless in the matter of lights. However, to resume my account of what happened. We reached our position at dawn, or slightly after. The weather was beautifully calm, and the sea like glass. As we were only 3 miles from the English coast, and close to the mouth of the Tyne, we were extraordinarily lucky to have nothing in sight, if one excepts a long smudge of smoke which trailed across the horizon to the southward. The land itself was obscured by early morning banks of mist, yet everything was so still that we actually faintly heard the whistle of a train. I could hardly restrain from suggesting to Alten that we should elevate the 10-centimetre gun to 15 degrees and fire a few rounds on to proud Albion's virgin shores, but I did not do so, as I felt fairly certain that he would not approve, and I do not wish to lay myself open to rebuffs from him after his behaviour concerning the smoking incident. I boil with rage at the thought, but again I digress. The fact that the land was obscured was favourable from the point of view that we were not worried by coast watchers, but unfavourable from the standpoint that we were unable to take bearings of anything and so ascertain our exact position. The importance of this point in submarine mine-laying is obvious, for, owing to our small cargo of eggs, it is quite possible that we may be sent here again to lay an adjacent field, in which case it is highly desirable to know the exact position of one's previous effort. We were somewhat assisted in our efforts to locate ourselves by the fact that a 7-fathom patch existed exactly where we had to lay. We picked up the edge of this bank with our sounding machine, and steering north half a mile, laid our mines in latitude. No, on second thoughts I will omit the precise position, for, though I shall take every precaution, there is no saying that through some misfortune this journal might not get into the wrong hands. I am very glad I decided to keep these notes, as I shall take much pleasure in reading them when victory crowns our efforts and the joys of a peaceful life return. I found it a delightful sensation being so close to the enemy coast, in his territorial waters, in fact. For the first time since the Skajerack battle I experienced the personal joys of war, the sensation of intimate and successful contact with the enemy, and the most hated enemy at that. We had hardly finished laying our eggs when a droning noise was heard. With marvellous celerity we dived, that damned fellow Alten, who under these circumstances leaves the bridge last, treading on my fingers as he followed me down the conning tower ladder. The engineer endeavoured to sympathize with me, and made some idiotic remark about my being quicker when I had had more practice. I bit his head off. I can't stand this hail fellow well met attitude in these U.C. boats from any lout dressed in an officer's uniform. They wouldn't be holding commissions if it wasn't for the war, and they should remember that fact. I suppose they think I'm standoffish. Well, if they had my family tree behind them, they would understand. We dived to 60 feet, and then came up to 20. Alten looked through the periscope and then invited me to look. Curiosity impelled me to accept this favour, and, putting the focusing lever to skyscrape, I swept round the sky. At last I saw him. He was a small gas bag of diminutive size, beneath which was suspended a little car, the most ridiculous little travesty of an airship I have ever seen. He was nosing along at about 800 feet and making about 40 knots. Suddenly he must have seen the wake of our periscope, for he turned towards us. Simultaneously Alten, from the conning tower (I was using the other periscope in the control room), ordered the boat to 60 feet and put the helm hard over. We had turned 16 points, 180 degrees, and in about 2 minutes heard a series of reports right astern of us. It was evident that our ruse had succeeded, and that he had overshot the mark. Inside the boat one felt a slight jar as each bomb went off. We gradually came round to our proper course, and cruised all day submerged at dead slow speed. Every time we lifted our periscope he was still hanging about sufficiently close to make it foolish for us to come to the surface. Towards noon a group of trawlers, doubtless summoned by wireless, appeared, and proceeded to wander about. These seemed to concern Alten far more than the airship, and he informed me that from their, to me, aimless movements he deduced they were hunting for us by hydroplanes. Occasionally we lay on the bottom in 19 fathoms. By 4 p.m. the atmosphere was becoming rather unpleasant and hot, and gradually we took off more clothes. Curiously enough, I longed for a smoke, but wild horses would not have made me ask Alten for permission. At 8 p.m. it was sufficiently dark to enable us to rise, which gave me great pleasure, though the first rush of fresh air down the hatch made me vomit after hours of breathing the vitiated muck. On coming to the surface we saw nothing in sight, but a breeze had sprung up which caused spray to break over the bridge as we chugged along at 9 knots. Everyone was in high spirits, as always on the return journey, when the mind turns to the fatherland and all it holds. My mind turns to Zoe. I confess it to myself frankly. I hardly realized to what extent this woman had begun to influence me until we received the wireless signal ordering us to delay entering for 12 hours. The receipt of this news, trivial though the delay has been, threw a mantle of gloom over the crew. I participated in the depression, and, upon thought, rather wondered that this should be so. Self-analysis on the lines laid down by Schlesmanville (Footnote: Apparently some German author, of obscure origin, as I cannot find him in any book of reference. Etienne.) Revealed to me that the basis of my annoyance is the fact that my next meeting with Zoe is deferred. I feel instinctively that I shall have trouble here, and that I had better haul off a lee shore whilst there is manoeuvring room. And yet I secretly rejoice that every revolution of the propeller, every clank and rattle of the diesels brings us closer together. Alten has just come down from the bridge, and we chatted for some moments. It is evident that he wishes to apologize for his rudeness over the smoking incident. I was in error, I admit it frankly. At the same time I did not know that the battery was on charge, and to dash a match from my hand, I could have shot him where he stood. However, I am not vindictive, and as far as I am concerned the incident is ended. One thing I find trying in this small boat, and that is that I can find no space in which to do half my Müller exercises, the leg and arm swinging ones. I must see whether I can't invent a set of U-boat exercises. Good. In 2 hours we reached the Mole End light buoy. New entry. Submarine mess, Bruges. It is midnight, and as I write in my room at the top of the house the low rumble of the guns from the southwest vibrates faintly through the open window, for it is extraordinarily warm for the time of year, and I have flung back the curtains and risked the light shining. We spent the night at Zeebrugge and came up to the docks here next day. We shall probably be in for a week, and I am on 4 days' extended absence from the boat, which practically means that I can go where I like in the neighbourhood, provided I am handy to a telephone. After a short inward struggle I rang Zoe up on the telephone. Fortunately I did not call first. A man's voice answered, and for a moment I was dumbfounded. I guessed at once it was the Colonel, and I had counted so confidently on his being still away at the front. For an instant I felt speechless. An impulse came to me to ring off without further ado, but I restrained myself, and then a fine idea came into my head. "Who was that?" I said. "Colonel Stein," replied the voice, and my fears were confirmed, but my plan of campaign held good. "I am speaking," I continued, "on behalf of Lieutenant von Schenk." "Ah, yes," growled the voice, and for an instant a panic seized me, but I resumed. "He met Madame Stein at dinner some days ago, and she kindly asked him to call. He has asked me to ring up and inquire when it would be convenient, as he would like to meet you, sir, as well. He has been unable to ring up himself, as he was sent away from Bruges on duty early this morning." I smiled to myself at this little lie, and listened. "Your friend had better call tomorrow then, for I leave tomorrow evening for the Somme front. Will you tell him?" I replied that I would, and left the telephone well satisfied, but cursing the fates that made it advisable to keep clear of No. 10 Kapellestrasse for 36 hours. Needless to say, next day I rang up again in order to tell the Colonel that Lieutenant Schenk had apparently been detained, as he was not yet back in Bruges, and how I felt sure that he would be sorry at missing the Colonel, etc., etc. But all this camouflage was unnecessary, as she herself came to the phone. I could have kissed the instrument when I told her of my stratagem and heard her silvery laughter in my ear. "It is arranged that tomorrow, starting at 10:30, we motor for the day to the forest of Meten, taking our lunch and tea with us. Pray heaven the weather holds." Tonight in the mess it is generally considered that UB 40 has been lost. She is 10 days overdue, and was operating off Havre. She has made no signal for a fortnight. Such is the price of victory and the cost of war. Death, perhaps, in some terrible form, but, bah! Away with such thoughts. Tomorrow there is love, and life, and Zoe. Section 3 of The Diary of a U-Boat Commander. Once more it is night. Still the guns rumble on the same old dismal tones. And as it is raining now, it must be getting bad up at the front. Except for the rain, it might have been last night, but much has happened to me in the meanwhile. Today in the forest by Russellede I found I loved Zoe. Loved her as I've never yet loved woman. Loved her with my soul and all that is me. The day was gloriously fine when we started, and an hour's run took us to the forest. We left the car at an inn, and wandered down one of the glades. I carried the basket, and we strolled on until we found a suitable place deep in the heart of the forest. I have the sailor's love for woods, for their depths, their shadows, their mysteries, which are so vivid a contrast to the monotony of the sea, with the everlasting circle of the horizon and the half-bowl of the heavens above. In the forest today, though the leaves had turned to gold and red and brown, the beeches were still well covered, and overhead we were tented with a russet canopy. I say, at last we found a spot, or rather Zoe, who, with girlish pleasure in the adventure, had run ahead, called to me, and as I write I seem to hear the echoes of "Carl, Carl," which rang through the wood. When I came up to her, she proudly pointed to the place she had found. It was ideal. An outcrop of rock formed a miniature Matterhorn in the forest, and beneath its shelter, with the old trees as silent witnesses, we sat and joked and laughed, and made 20 attempts to light a fire. After lunch a little incident happened which had an enormous effect on me. Zoe asked me whether I would mind if she smoked. How many women in these days would think of doing that? And yet, had she but known it, I am still sufficiently old-fashioned to appreciate the implied respect for any possible prejudices which was contained in her request. After lunch I asked her a question to which I dreaded the answer. I asked her whether, now that the old colonel had gone to the Somme, whether that meant she would be leaving Bruges. She laughed and teasingly said, "Quien sabe, senor?" But, seeing my real anxiety on this point, she assured me that she was not leaving for the present. The colonel, she said, had a strange belief that once a man had served on the Flanders front, and especially on the Ypres salient, he always came back to die there. It appears that the colonel has done 14 months' service on the salient alone, and is firmly convinced he will end his career on that great burial ground. As we were talking about the colonel, I longed to ask her how she had met him, and perhaps find out why she lives with him, for I cannot believe she loves him, but I did not dare. Strangely enough, I found a curious shyness had taken hold of me with regard to Zoe. I said to myself, "Fool, you are alone with her. You long to kiss her. You have kissed her, first at the dinner party, secondly when you said good-bye at her flat. And yet today it was different. Then I was kissing a pretty woman. I was on the eve of a dangerous life, and I was simply extracting the animal pleasures whilst I lived. Today it was a case of Zoe, the personality I loved. I still longed to kiss her, but I wanted to have the unquestioned right to kiss her, as much as I wanted the kisses. I wanted to have her for my own, away from the contaminating ownership of the old colonel, and I determined to get her. I think she noticed the changed attitude on my part, and perhaps she felt herself that a subtle change in our relationship had taken place, and whilst I meditated on these things, she fell into a doze at my side. I was sitting slightly above her, smoking to keep the midges away, and as I looked down on her childish figure, a great tenderness for her filled my mind. She is very beautiful, and to me, desirable above all women. I can see her as she lay there trustfully at my feet. I will describe her, and then, When I get her photograph, I will read this when I am far away on a trip. She is of average height, for I am just over 6 feet and she reaches to just above my shoulder. Her hair is gloriously thick and of a deep black colour, and lies low on her forehead. Her complexion is of the purest whiteness beyond compare, which but accentuates the red warmth of the lips which encircle her little mouth. Her figure is slight, and her ankles are my delight, but her crowning glories, which I have purposely left till last, are her eyes. I feel I could lose my soul. I have lost it, if I have one, in the violet depths of those eyes, which were veiled as she slept by the long black eyelashes which curled up delicately as they rested on her cheeks. I have reread this description, and it is oh so unsatisfying. Would I had the pen of a Goethe or a Shakespeare, yet for want of more skill the description shall stand. Now I long for her to be mine, and yet, unfortunate that I am, I cannot for certain declare that she loves me. 1,000 doubts arise. I torment myself with recollections of her behaviour at the dinner party, when within 2 hours of our first meeting she gave me her lips. Yet did I not first roughly kiss her as we danced? I find consolation in the fact that, though she has said nothing, yet her conduct today was different. She was so quiet after tea as we wandered back through the forests, with the setting sun striking golden beams aslant the tree trunks. Before we left I sang to her Tchaikovsky's beautiful song, To the Forest, and I think she was pleased, for I may say with justice that my voice is of high quality for an amateur, and the song goes well without an accompaniment, whilst the atmosphere and surroundings were ideal. There was only one jarring note in a perfect day. When we returned to the car, the chauffeur permitted himself a sardonic grin. Zoe unfortunately saw it, and blushed scarlet. I could have struck him on his impudent mouth, but for her sake I judged it advisable to notice nothing. I feel I could go on writing about her all night, but it is nearly 2 a.m. I must get some sleep. The guns rumble steadily in the southwest, and the sky is lit by their flashes. May the fighting on the Somme be bloody these coming days. New entry. Probably about 10 days later. Etienne. We leave tonight, having had a longer spell than usual. I am in a distracted state of mind. Since our glorious day in the forest I have seen her nearly every afternoon, though twice that swine Alton has kept me in the boat in connection with some replacements of the battery. I have found out that, like me, she is intensely musical. She plays beautifully on the piano, and we had long hours together playing Chopin and Beethoven. We also played some of Mussorgsky's duets, but I love her best when she plays Chopin, the composer preeminent of love and passion. She has masses of music, as the Colonel gives her what she likes. We also played a lot of Debussy. At first I demurred at playing a living French composer's works, but she pouted and looked so adorable that all my scruples vanished in an instant, so we closed all the doors, and she played it for hours very softly, while I forgot the war and all its horrors, and remembered only that I was with the well-beloved girl. The Colonel writes from Thiepval, where the British are pouring out their blood like water. He writes very interesting letters, and has had many narrow escapes, but unfortunately he seems to bear a charmed life. His letters are full of details, and I wonder he gets them past the field censorship, but I suppose he censors his own. She laughs at them and calls them her Colonel's dispatches. She says he is so accustomed to writing official reports that the poor old man can't write an ordinary letter. I told her that I thought the way he mentioned regiments and dispositions rather indiscreet, and she agrees, but she says he has asked her to keep them, with a view to forming a collection of letters written from the front, whilst the incidents he describes are vivid in his mind. I suppose the old ass knows his own business, and one day the collection may be completed by a telegram, regretting to announce, etc., etc. The sooner the better. So the days passed pleasantly enough, and never by a gesture or word of mouth did she show that I was more to her than any other pleasant young man. I kissed her when I arrived. I kissed her when I left. Each day was the same. She would put her arms round my neck and look long and deeply into my eyes, then she would gently kiss my lips. Not an atom of emotion, not a spark from the fires which I feel must be raging beneath that diabolically extraordinary, amazingly calm exterior. On ordinary subjects she would chatter vivaciously enough, and she can talk in a fascinating manner on every subject I care to bring up. But as soon as I drew the conversation round to a personal line, she gradually became more silent, and a far-away and distant look came into those wonderful eyes. I have found out nothing about her beyond the fact that she has travelled all over Europe. I don't even know how old she is, but I should guess 26. I tried to find out a few details by means of discreet remarks at the club and elsewhere. She simply arrived here about a year ago, as a singer, and met the Colonel. Beyond that all is mystery. Everything about her attracts me powerfully, and this mystery adds subtleties to her charms. This afternoon I went to say good-bye. I told her we were leaving shortly, and she gently reproved me for disobeying the order which forbids discussion of movements, but I could see she was not greatly displeased. After tea she played to me music of the modern Russian school, Arensky, Sibelius, and Pilsudski. A storm was brewing, and we both felt sad. She played for an hour or so, and then came and sat by me on a low divan by the fire. We were silent for a long while in the gathering gloom, whilst 1,000 thoughts chased each other swiftly through my brain, as I endeavoured to summon up courage to say what I had determined I must say before I left her, perhaps forever. At last, when only her profile was visible against the glow of the logs, I spoke. I told her quietly, calmly, and almost dispassionately that I had grown to love her, and that to me she was life itself. I told her that I had tried not to speak until I could endure no longer. She sat very still as I spoke, and when I had finished there was a long silence, and I gently stretched out my hand and stroked her lovely black hair. At last she rose, and with averted face walked across the room, and stood looking at the storm through the big bow windows. I watched her, but did not dare follow. At length she returned to me, and I saw what I had instinctively known the whole time, that she had been crying. I could not think why. She put her arms round my neck, kissed me on the forehead, and murmured, "Poor Karl." I felt crushed. I dared not move, for fear of breaking the magic of the moment, yet I longed to know more. I felt overwhelmed by some colossal mystery that seemed to be enveloping me in its folds. Why did she pity me? Why did she weep? Why didn't she answer my avowal? Why didn't she tell me something? Such were some of the problems that perplexed me. It was thus when the clock chimed 7. I told her that my leave was up at 7 o'clock, and that at 7:15 I had to be back on board the boat. She remembered this, and in an instant the past quarter of an hour might never have existed. She was all agitation and nervousness lest I should be late on board, though at the moment I would have cheerfully missed the boat to hear her say she loved me. I tried to protest, but in vain. With feminine quickness she utilized the incident to avoid a situation she evidently found full of difficulty, and at 7:10, with the memory of a light kiss on my lips and her Godspeed in my ears, I was in a taxi driving to the docks in a blinding rainstorm, and we sailed tonight. For 5, 6, 7, perhaps 10 days at the least, and at the most forever, I am doomed to be away from her and without news of her, and I don't even know whether she loves me. I think I can say she cares for me up to a certain point, but I want more. O Zoe of the violet eyes, and hair of blackest night, thy lips are brightest crimson, thy skin is dazzling white. Oh, lay your head upon my breast, and lift your lips to mine, then murmur in soft breathings, drink deep from what is thine. Then let the war rage onward, let kingdoms rise and fall. To each shall be the other, their life, their hope, their all. Footnote: I am indebted to Commander C.C. for the above rough translation of Karl's effusion. Signed, Etienne. End of footnote. New entry. At sea. We are bound for the same old spot as last time. Alten must have been drinking like a fish lately. His breath smells like a distillery. He is apparently partial to schnapps, which he gets easily in Bruges. I can't help admiring the man, as he is a rigid teetotaler at sea, though he must find the strain well nigh intolerable, judging from the condition he was in when he came on board last night. He was really totally unfit to take charge of the boat, and I virtually took her down the canal, though with sottish obstinacy he insisted on remaining on the bridge. This morning, though his complexion was a hideous yellow colour, he seems quite all right. I shall play a little trick on him at dinner tonight. I have begun to get to know some of the crew by now. They are a fine lot of youngsters with a seasoning of half a dozen older men. The coxswain, Schmidt by name, is a splendid old petty officer who has been in the U-boat service since 1911. His favourite enjoyment is to spin yarns to the younger members of the crew, who know of his weakness and play up to it. He has a favourite expression which runs thus: His Majesty the Kaiser said Germany's future lies on the sea. I say Germany's future lies under the sea. He is inordinately fond of this statement, and the youngsters continually say, "What made you take to U-boat work, Schmidt?" And the invariable reply is as above. When he has been asked the question about half a dozen times in the course of a day, he is liable to become suspicious, and if his questioner is within range, Schmidt stares at him for a few seconds in an absent-minded way. Then an arm like that of a gorilla shoots out, and the quizzer, in original translation, Untersucher, receives a resounding box on the ears, to the huge delight of his companions. The old man then permits his iron-lipped mouth to relax into a caustic smile, after which he is left in peace for some time. At the wheel he is an artist, for he seems to divine what the next order is going to be, or if he is steering her on a course he predicts the direction of the next wave, even as a skilful chess player works out the moves ahead. New entry. I am rather weak and ought to go to bed, but before I lose the savour I must record the splendid fun I had with Alten at dinner. We were dining alone, as the navigator was on the bridge, and the engineer was busy with a slight leak in the cooking water service. I have said that, though a heavy drinker by nature, Alten is a strict abstainer at sea. Accordingly I produced a small flask of rum, half-way through dinner, and helped myself to a liberal tot, placing the liquor between us on the table. As the sight met his eyes and the aroma greeted his nostrils, a gleam of joy flashed across his face, to be succeeded by a frown. With an amiable smile I proffered the flask to him, remarking at the same time, "You don't drink at sea, do you?" In a thick voice he muttered, "No. Yes, no, thank you." With an air of having noticed nothing, I resumed my meal, but out of the corner of my eye I watched his left hand on the table near the flask. It was most interesting. All the veins stood out like ropes, and his knuckles almost burst through the skin. This went on for about 30 seconds, then he choked out something about needing a breath of fresh air. As he got up his face was brick red, and I almost thought he'd have a fit. Whether by accident or design he pulled the cloth as he got out from between the settee and the table and upset the flask. He was apparently incapable of apologizing, for he rushed up on deck. A few minutes later the navigating officer came down and asked me what was up. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, the captain came up just now, swearing like a trooper, and told me to get to the devil out of it. It didn't seem advisable to question him, so I got out of it and came down." I expressed my opinion that the captain must be feeling seasick and was ashamed to say so. I also suggested to the navigator that he should take the captain a little brandy in case he was not feeling well, but the navigator declared he was going to stay down in the warmth till he was sent for. Alten is a great coarse brute. Fancy allowing a material substance such as alcohol to grip one's mentality. Thank heaven I have nerves of iron. Nothing would affect me. And now to bed, though I must just read my account of our day in the forest. Darling girl, may I dream of thee.